Hello everyone. This video lecture is relatively short. It'll just be going over the upcoming experimental survey paper, which is due May 13th by 11:59 p.m. So in this video lecture, I'll be going over just some expectations for some of the sections and going a little more in depth on the results section and what's expected with that. So starting with the introduction. So the introduction is a bit more thorough than the Project 1 or the observational research report, because with this introduction, you are expected to have at least 5 peer-reviewed scientific articles. So you are expected to provide a thorough literature review that features at least 5 relevant peer-reviewed scientific articles. So these must be from scientific journals, so things like blog posts and the like do not count. Additionally, when you are referring to these articles in text, they must be cited properly with APA-style in-text citations. You also must provide rationale for the current study, so when you have your final paragraph talking about the present study, talk about any gaps in the research you found that this survey addressed, why you feel it's important, etc. And you must clearly state your hypothesis or hypotheses. So you should have one hypothesis for each independent and dependent variable pairing. So if you are somebody who's looking at something like perceived professionalism and perceived trust, you should have 2 separate hypotheses, one for each of those variables. So moving to the method section. So this section is going to be a bit longer than the first paper because we do have a relatively long survey. So we have a little bit more methodology. You need to include information on the sample used. So I put the data file on Canvas. It is in the experimental survey project module, and it'll be towards the bottom of that module. So you need to report the total number of participants, demographic information, so talk about the average age per sample, the number of participants per group, the gender breakdown, things of that nature. And you can do that through running frequency analyses, which I also include in the SPSS how-to guides page. You also must provide accurate information about our survey. So I did publish a document containing the questions that were used in our survey, along with what dependent variable they were going to measure, or if they were distractor questions. So what you should do is you should go through that document and provide at least 2 sample dependent variable questions that you used for your analysis. So for example, if you are focused on the dependent variable of perceived professionalism, your 2 sample questions should be measuring perceived professionalism. So make sure you are including relevant questions. Additionally, when talking about things like recruitment, you'll talk about how the class posted on their social media pages. You can talk about how you encourage snowball sampling, which is encouraging people to share our survey with other people they think might be interested. So your method section should be relatively thorough. You also need to provide things like how many questions were on our survey, how long it should take. All that information, again, can be found on that document that I put on Canvas. And I do believe I also included some of that information on our the sample recruitment post as well. So next, the results section. So this section I'm going to be spending a bit more time talking about because this results section is going to be a bit more in-depth than the first results section, because you are required to now have at least 2 statistical analyses, and you need to accurately present them in APA style. So one of your 2 analyses must be an independent samples t-test. So the other can either be a t-test or a chi-square. However, please make sure you are choosing the appropriate statistical test for your variables. So the t-test, I have a how-to guide on Canvas in the SPSS How-To Guides page that tells you how to run an independent samples t-test. How it works is your independent variable can only have two groups. So one of your analyses must use the line 71 variable of IV photo viewed from the data file. This is the independent variable. This is basically it's a survey block question, so it shows whether or not they saw the picture with the tattoos or if they were in the control group and saw the picture with no tattoos. So going back to how to choose your test, so I'm going to talk a bit more about t-tests on the next slide. Chi-square should more than likely not be used. The only time chi-squares are appropriate to use is when you're using categorical variables. So these are answers to specific questions, and these categorical variables, basically those numbers are dummy codes. They don't mean anything, whereas a continuous variable that's used in a t-test, those numbers, those scores mean something. If you want to look at answers to a specific question, please use the combo variables, because if you are using one of the questions from above the survey, maybe you just want to look at, if they found this person appears to be professional, you have to use the combo variable, because each block, if you read through the data file, there's two of each question because there are two separate blocks. However, participants only saw one of those blocks. They either saw the block associated with the tattooed picture or the block that was associated with the non-tattoo picture. So the combo variables are the only variables that address those specific questions that are asked, but includes answers from both blocks. So if you are interested in pursuing answers to specific dependent variable questions and you want to use a chi-square, please make sure you're using the appropriate combo variables that are towards the end of our data file. So again, at least one of your analyses has to use that photo viewed variable. That's the line 71 variable. Again, this is the variable that tells us whether they were in the experimental group, so they saw the picture with tattoos, or if they were in the control group and they saw a picture without tattoos. You have to use that for at least one of your analyses. And you must include at least one APA style table or figure to display your results. There's how-to guide on SPSS on the SPSS how-to page, as well as the APA assistant page also features some information on APA style tables and how to make bar graphs in SPSS. So please utilize those two pages to help you as you're working on the results section. So I do want to discuss the t-test because this is something we haven't used in this class yet. The t-tests, they are used to test the differences between two groups for continuous variables only. So what continuous variables are, these are variables where the scores have meaning. So the higher the score, it means something, and they're not dummy codes. Dummy codes are the numbers that are assigned, for example, to the Likert scale individual options. The numbers themselves don't mean anything. It just allows the data to be measured with a statistical test. T-tests only should be used for continuous variables such as the perceived professionalism score. So I do want to just go over some appropriate dependent variables for this analysis. So perceived professionalism is one of them. Total trust, the total general impressions, and then I created a total perception variable that combines professionalism, trust, and general impressions into one variable for a total, either positive perception, or the lower the score, the more negative the perception. Information on these variables can be found in the codebook that I posted along with the data file on our Canvas page. Appropriate independent variables. So the IV photo viewed variable is going to be the easiest variable for you to use because when you run t-tests, the automatic code for your independent variable will be 1 and 2, which is how I coded the photo viewed variable. However, if you're interested in looking at a demographic variable or like the post-survey questions, maybe you wanted to see if those who, reported having tattoos or reported a favorable attitude had a more favorable perception. If you want to use those, you have to sort them into two groups because the independent samples t-test will only be able to run two groups against each other. The automatic code is 1 and 2, which I think for gender identity, that'll work. But if you want to do something like the race ethnicity variable, I do believe we include, or like the educational status, you have to make sure you are identifying the code that's associated with the groups you want to look at. So for example, if you want to look at groups 3 and 4, which would be later answer choices, you would have to type that into the independent variable section. So making sure that the codes you are using are matching the codes that you want to be investigating. You can also create a median split for age. So maybe you want to compare generational differences. So maybe you want to see if those who were younger than the mean age had a different attitude than those who were older. You can do that. I do include information on that SPSS how-to page on how to create new variables if you are interested in creating a new independent variable. However, please, again, make sure at least one of your analyses uses the IV photo viewed variable. So again, I do have a SPSS how-to guide on how to do t-tests that sort of explains in depth how to do things. If you have any questions as you're working on the data analysis, please let me know. I did move the due date from what would have been this Sunday back towards the middle of the week. That way you'll have some additional time. And that way, if you're interested, you can stop by office hours and I can help you with it if you'd like that. So lastly, the discussion section. So the discussion section is going to be a bit more in depth than the first one as well, because we have some more information. We have a lot more data that we're going to be talking about in the results section. Therefore, our discussion section is going to be longer. So in your discussion, you have to clearly state whether your hypothesis or hypotheses found support. You need to circle back to at least 2 of the articles from your literature review in your introduction and discuss your findings in terms of those past research. So did those findings agree with past research, or were they, opposing each other? And if so, how were they different? Provide at least one alternative explanation for the results. So I go over this in a couple of lectures, but basically what happens when we're using self-report data, sometimes it's not as cut and dry. So sometimes there are some alternative explanations. So for example, maybe you're just looking at the IV photo variable for both your independent variables. Potentially an alternative explanation could be, if there's any demographic differences between those groups, maybe that difference in score was the result of a demographic difference. Identify at least one limitation of the study. So what do you feel the shortcomings were? Please don't just be generic and say, we could have asked more in-depth questions. Be specific. So be specific. If you had complete control over this study, since this was a class collaborative effort, I know a lot of you, or at least some of you, maybe had a question that you really wanted in there that didn't get included because it didn't get enough votes. If you feel like a shortcoming, like a specific shortcoming, so maybe you really wished you had that one question in there that didn't make it, that could be, considered a limitation of, maybe we didn't include enough of a variety of questions, things like that. Be creative. And then provide at least one direction for future research. So if you, on your own, given complete control over this survey, could do it again, what would you change and why? So make sure you're justifying that direction for future research. So next, reference page. So your reference page has to include at least 5 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles properly cited in APA format. You can use up to 2 articles that I provide on Canvas for class if they're appropriate or relevant to your paper. So I did have one for this week that does involve tattoos and perception of individuals with tattoos, and you're more than welcome to use that in your literature review if you'd like. So some reminders. So make sure you're checking the APA manual or Purdue OWL website if you don't have access to the APA manual to ensure you are meeting APA style standards, especially for things like in-text citations, the reference page, and your table or figure. Please follow the rubric and the instructions I provide for you on the experimental survey project manual on our Canvas page. While this video went over most of it, I didn't go over everything, so make sure you are referring back to the rubric and instructions as you are writing your paper to ensure you are meeting the appropriate criteria for each section. I also want to highlight, since the due date for this paper is the last day of classes, which is May 13th by 11:59 p.m., no late papers are accepted 2 days past the original due date. So this is a change. Usually I accept late work up to 3 days, but since it is that last day of classes, Maddie and I will need some time to grade, and there's a quick turnaround between the last day of classes and when grades are due. So unfortunately, we can't accept late papers 2 days past the original due date, and that 10% deduction per day late is still there. My advice, do not wait until the last minute. So even if you are struggling with the analyses, you can still write your introduction and the method section because you have all the information that you need to successfully complete those. So do not wait until the last minute to start this paper because it is going to be a bit more in depth and the expectations are a bit higher than that first time around. And as always, if you have any questions as you're working on your paper, please feel free to reach out to myself or Maddie. We are more than happy to help you and give you any advice. If you don't have any questions, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. And again, please make sure you're reaching out. If you just want some clarity or you want to ensure you're on the right path, I am more than happy to help. Thank you.